Well, good evening and welcome. My name is Andrew Fitzgerald, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Advancing American Values, the organization hosting the distinguished lecture series this evening featuring Professor Danielle Allen. I don't like the feedback on this mic. Can you hear the feedback? Okay, if it doesn't get fixed, we'll switch. For more than 2 decades, the Distinguished Lecture Series has brought leading academics, journalists, scientists, and more to promote discussion of important issues that face our nation and our world. Some of you may know that this is Dr. Allen's second time with our series. She joined us during the pandemic and was on Zoom. The conversation was so full of stimulation and insight that we knew we wanted to bring her back this time in person. But before we launch into that discussion, I have a few announcements and some thank yous. So first announcement, please silence your cell phones or turn them off or, I don't know, put them away. Second, President Trump is sorry that she can't be here this evening. She's not feeling well. She wanted to be sure to extend her greetings to you all. Her office joins the tradition of presidents at this university who have supported the Distinguished Lecture Series over the past several decades. Question and answer procedure. You'll see a microphone there and a microphone there. At the conclusion of our conversation, you're welcome to queue up and ask questions. But we do ask that you ask a question and keep it short, please, so that we can get to as many questions as possible. But we cannot promise that we'll get to every question because we are going to end after an hour and 15 or 20 minutes or so of presentation.
Okay, so it's possible your question won't be able to be answered, but please do ask one and keep it brief. You'll see some tables in the back at the end of tonight's presentation. Feel free to mingle among our civic fair. This is something we started, Dr. Isaac Castellano, last semester when we had David Brooks here. We've continued it. We've got partners from across Boise and the Treasure Valley to have you think about how you might want to get involved in civic life. So thank you for all those groups that have joined us this evening. So some thank yous, additional thank yous. Tonight's presentation is sponsored by Buffington Moore McNeil and the Bryant Corporation. Buffington Moore McNeil, a wealth management firm, has been supporting this series since 2016. Please join me in applauding their support. Also, the Bryant Corporation, which is a residential and commercial development firm dedicated to creating places of lasting value for our community. Support also comes from Boise State Public Radio. Thank you again to all of our sponsors. Now, a word about the Institute for Advancing American Values. If you've seen me before, I often open with this, which is the question I usually get. What do you mean by values? Who decides? And what are they? Well, those are all good questions. And the way that we respond here at the Institute is that everyone has values. They come from family, they come from education, they come from religion, economics, politics, and more. And most everyone has values. And they have values about the very values associated with this country. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, freedom of expression, equality, pluralism, public education, and opportunity, and more. We generally agree on those concepts as values, but we disagree about their expression in our history and in our policies and politics. And the Institute asks all of us to talk and listen to one another on those agreements and disagreements. And I'll draw from Danielle Allen's work to illustrate what we are up to. She writes, "Democracy depends on trustful talk among strangers." That's what we hope for and attempt to facilitate. Trustful talk that may not lead to agreement, but usually leads to greater regard for a fellow human being or group. And we've been busy together drawing folks from a range of backgrounds for that trustful talk. And we have some events that you saw on our tables and maybe out in the audience there of upcoming opportunities to engage and enjoy trustful talk among strangers. We have Boise State Listens on February 25th. Right down the hall in Simplot Ballroom at 7 o'clock. That's where we ask our students from a variety of backgrounds to address the question, what do you value and why? And that's a takeoff of our statewide program, Idaho Listens, where we do the same thing. We've gone all across the state, asked speakers from a range of backgrounds, professions, to speak about what they value and why. And the kicker is the audience remains silent. We have no Q&A, we have no moderator. We're just to listen to the strangers talk and speak about what they value and why, and then we have conversation afterward. On March 4th, we'll have a renowned ethicist, Professor Robin Lovin, who will speak on virtue and politics in our Alumni and Friends Center. You're welcome to that as well. Free parking over there at the Alumni and Friends Center. On March 6th, we've joined with Mountain States Policy Center. They've started a great debate series on college campuses around the Northwest, and they're putting on a program on the plastic bag ban, really targeting students to come and hear about, is it eco-friendly or ineffective? I think it says on the flyer. Our undergraduate fellows, institute fellows, will be walking around with those flyers. They also have a QR code, so if you're a student who's here for extra credit, they'll have a QR code at the end of the presentation. You can scan that. If you're not a student but want extra credit, you could try to scan it and see what happens. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. And Dr. Allen started her time with students today, and she offered a wonderful session, really an impromptu seminar. She followed that with a dinner among community members and institute board members, and we kind of had a second seminar over dinner. And the theme tonight, Educating for American Democracy, couldn't be more timely. Nationally, we know, and part of the reason we know is because of Professor Allen's work, that civics and history education has declined, and so too has the average American's knowledge of our history and the workings of our experiment in self-government. It may be akin to a Sputnik moment for civics. And Dr. Allen has dedicated much of her scholarship, speaking, and teaching to building capacity for educating for American democracy. She is a professor of political philosophy, public policy, and ethics at Harvard University. She is the director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation, director of the Democratic Knowledge Project, and James Bryant Conant University professor, one of Harvard's highest honors. She is also founder and president of Partners in Democracy. At Partners in Democracy, she advocates for democracy renovation to create greater voice and access in our democracy and drive progress toward a new social contract that serves and includes us all. Her many books include the widely acclaimed Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality, Democracy in the Time of Coronavirus, and most recently, Justice by Means of Democracy. Tonight, she and I will be engaged in a conversation. Professor Allen delivers a wonderful lecture, but also eagerly engages through question and answer. Think of the expertise to dive in without having any of these questions ahead of time. So we'll get started now on the theme, Educating for American Democracy. Please welcome Professor Danielle Allen to the stage.
Do your questions have an extra credit question for me?
Extra credit question for you. Yes, that's a good idea. What color is Boise State's football field?
Blue.
There we go. So I have been particularly inspired by Professor Allen's work. Her book, Our Declaration, that I just mentioned, is being assigned in a course I'm teaching right now called Reading the Republic, which is an effort to think about and prepare for our America 250 moment, which is upcoming, 250th anniversary of the Declaration, or better known as the semi-quincentennial. So or lesser known.
Can we say that 5 times fast?
Yeah, exactly. Semi-quincentennial. I'm a bicentennial baby. I feel bad for the semi-quincentennial babies because they have to learn to say that word. So in the class, I assigned a paper, a review of her book. And I wanted to start with a student quotation from a review of this very book. The student writes, in commenting on Danielle Allen's work, an idea that stuck out as particularly profound was Allen's suggestion that we celebrate principles, even if we often haven't lived up to them throughout history because eventually they inspire progress. It perfectly voices, that is, Professor Allen's book, perfectly voices how we can have an appreciation for the ideas America has been built on, even if there have been vast shortcomings. It gives space to acknowledge those shortcomings and still have pride in our founding. And I'm wondering, Professor Allen, if you could just respond to that student's comment about your work.
Well, thank you. Let me first just say thank you very much, Dean Finstuen, for the invitation, and to all of your colleagues for the generous hospitality that you've shown me all afternoon. And thank you so much, all of you who've come out tonight. I know everybody has busy lives, so the fact that you've made time for this conversation is really encouraging. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate that comment and question from your student. So my book, Our Declaration, is about the Declaration of Independence. It's a close reading of the text, and very often people will dismiss the Declaration sort of out of hand on the grounds that it was written by Thomas Jefferson, who held human beings in bondage. And the worry, understandable worry, is that there's a hypocrisy there between the lived practice of Thomas Jefferson and the principles articulated in the Declaration. And it's really impossible to think about the Declaration or to think about the founding without wrestling with that contrast between the stated commitment to all humanity being created equal and the realities on the ground. Now, the experience of diving deep into the Declaration is to discover actually just how much already in 1776 people were wrestling with precisely that contrast between the ideals and the reality. And I like to share with people that John Adams played as much of a role in the development of the Declaration of Independence as Thomas Jefferson. Now, John Adams, some of you will recall, was initially vice president, then president. He was from Massachusetts, cousin of Sam Adams, and he was as much a drafter of the Declaration as Jefferson. He never held slaves. He always thought enslavement was wrong. And in fact, the Declaration of Independence, after its signing in 1776, was used within 6 months by free African Americans in Massachusetts to put a petition to the Massachusetts Assembly to abolish slavery in Massachusetts. And indeed, then, thanks to John Adams's work using the text of the Declaration, drafting the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780, enslavement was abolished in Massachusetts before the end of the Revolutionary War. And I tell that story because it makes the point that even at the time of the founding, some of the hard questions were being wrestled with. People were already struggling with the question of how to square a commitment to equality with the reality on the ground. And it's exactly in that wrestling that I take so much inspiration. They did, in fact, take the principles seriously enough to do hard political things, like the work I just described on the part of John Adams. And even Jefferson did not rest sort of easy with the status quo as things were. He also thought that slavery couldn't have a permanent existence in the United States. He had a different solution than Adams, a solution I wouldn't endorse. He thought that Africans should be free, but in Africa, right? So in some sense, he wanted a kind of separate and equal picture of rights. But the point is that that initial commitment to equality did lodge deeply in the national psyche and forced people to really experiment, to try different things as they thought about social possibilities. So I hope that is responsive to your student's question. And if you're here, you'll have to let me know in the Q&A if that was responsive.
Well, I think I'd just like to build on that and stick with the students for a moment, because what the students were really also interested in is your chapter on patrimony, the chapter where you describe, as I quote you here, "Yes, I claim the Declaration as patrimony as can anyone." Tell us what you mean about that statement and how it illustrates a personal engagement, your personal engagement with the founding document.
Well, one of the things that the Declaration of Independence says about itself is that it is an offering to a candid world. First, they make a statement of principles, though we hold these truths to be self-evident. Sentence, then they acknowledge that governments shouldn't be changed for light and transient causes, and that therefore they have to declare their list of grievances against the king and against British Parliament. And they introduce that list of grievances by saying, "Let facts be declared to a candid world." And that phrase, a candid world, is really an invitation to every person to consider the case, to make a judgment about whether or not they had a valid case of complaint and reasonable grounds for pursuing independence, pursuing a revolution on the path to independence. So to recognize that the Declaration, in effect, gives itself to everybody, and it, more importantly than that even, gives itself to everybody, recognizing that everybody can judge it, is to hear an invitation. Is to hear an invitation to each one of us to be a judge of the case in the Declaration, to be a judge of the principles the Declaration articulates for how human beings can organize themselves. And so that's the sense in which the text is for everybody. It is the patrimony for every human being on the planet, and indeed it's been copied world over hundreds of times. At the same time, of course, it's a specifically American inheritance. It is, after all, the creed, in effect, that helps us structure our institutions of self-government. We are a people, not because we're all from the same place, not because we all have the same religion, not because we all speak the same language. We are a people because we subscribe to a shared creed. Nothing more than that, at the end of the day, binds us together. And so for that reason, too, to recognize it as an inheritance that we share, I could look at any other person in this country and know that our own heritage, in some sense, is anchored in this document. For all of the rest of our differences, we share that. Whether we love it or feel aggravated by it, nonetheless, we share it as inheritance. That's a starting point for understanding ourselves as a people.
Thank you. So the overall topic for the conversation, educating for American democracy. Before I ask a question, I'd like to read two quotations from two different founders. Thomas Jefferson, wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. George Washington, promote then as an object of primary importance institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. It is essential that public opinion should be enlightened. So how might Jefferson and Washington give a grade to this country on educating for American democracy?
Oh, that's a softball question. Well, let's think a little minute about our history, the history of how we have educated for American democracy. And then we can perhaps see both why we're struggling on that front right now and then think together about what we might do about it. Often folks don't realize that public education in this country goes back to the colonial era, to the 1630s and 1640s in Massachusetts. You can tell I'm kind of a Massachusetts. I got bias for Massachusetts here, but forgive me. And the reason, so what happened first was there was a belief that young people needed to understand the laws. Just as simple as that. Young people needed to understand the laws so that they could follow them, and so that if they had a grievance, they could draw on the laws to raise their grievance. And so the colonial legislature in Massachusetts supported all the towns in developing funds to pay for instruction for young people. This was a very radical thing to do. In England at the time, laws were not broadly available to the general public. It was just plain hard even to get your hands on the text of laws. So the notion that you would educate an entire generation in the laws was already in itself to lay the foundation for constitutional democracy, right? Think about it. The fact that any one of us can read any of the laws whenever we want, that wasn't always true in human history. And it is what makes us, empowers us to be governing citizens, self-governing citizens. So that is where our education system started in this country. And astonishingly, you may know that, of course, the U.S. Constitution does not have a right to education in it, but nearly every state constitution does. I think it's 48 or so states have a right to education in the state constitution. And when you look at the jurisprudential history for those state constitutions, what you find is that nearly the supermajority of them have the reason for having that right to education is in order to prepare citizens. It's not to prepare workers, it's to prepare citizens. So the economic value of education matters too, but the first purpose was the preparation of citizens, exactly as Washington and Jefferson were reflecting on in those comments. So you might well then wonder, well, if everybody knew for so long that education had as a primary purpose preparing people to be free and equal self-governing citizens, what's happened? Why don't we have so much civic education any longer in the country? Why has there been such a decline? And the answer there is really a bit of an accident. It's really a story about how this country has responded to moments of competition with other nations around the globe. So first, there was World War II. And of course, in that period of time, there was an incredible sense of urgency around beating Germany in the production of the atom bomb. And that competition, that race with Germany to get the atom bomb first, led to phenomenal investment by the federal government in the STEM components of universities, sciences and engineering. And that is really how the 20th century modern science-based research university kind of got going. It was really a result of that World War II competition. And then shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, this first satellite. They beat the United States into space with a satellite. And this was very alarming to Eisenhower. And it led him to worry that the US was going to lose the space race with the Soviet Union. So he passed education policy, or he led it through Congress, to invest in scientific education so that the US could maintain competitiveness with the Soviet Union. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, we found ourselves in a sort of hard, staring-eyed economic competition with Japan. And we were extremely worried that the Japanese economy was going to just trump ours, completely knock us back on our heels. And so in that moment as well, again, President Reagan at the time drove through educational policy where the concern was to achieve global economic competitiveness. And the pathway to that was investing in STEM education. You can see where this is going. Then in the early 90s, we came to see that the global economy had generated a phenomenon of widening income inequality, widening wealth inequality. And economists started studying this in the late 80s and early 90s. They asked the question, what's the cause and what to do about it? And they came to the conclusion that the reason we were seeing this rise in income inequality was because of what they call the wage premium on STEM skills. So the wage premium on STEM skills mean that if you had STEM skills, you would earn more money in the marketplace because there weren't enough people with STEM skills to go around for the growing number of STEM jobs. So what's the solution to income inequality? It is making sure that more people get educated with STEM skills to drive down the wage premium on those STEM jobs and try to have more of a middling income economy. So 1990s, we got more educational investment in STEM education. Now, the result of this was that as of a few years ago, if you look at just how the federal government invests in education, we were investing about $50 per kid per year in STEM education and 5 cents per kid per year in civic education. So that's one of those moments where I say you get what you pay for. So here we are. Now there's one more chapter to this story, if you don't mind my sharing it. So the story is partly about our need for STEM education, and we do need it. I'm not trying to set up a kind of competition between STEM education and civics education. We need both, actually. So we need to be ambitious in our education. And in addition, the other challenge that we hit as a country when it came to educating our young people was polarization. Just the fact that the grown-ups don't get along. It's just like a family where the parents don't get along and the kids really suffer, all right? So what happened in our case in this country was that for several generations in the 1990s and in the 2000s, every time somebody thought, okay, it's really time, we've really got to invest in social studies and civics education, the effort would be thwarted by fights about how to narrate our nation's history. The last time this happened was in about 2004, 2005, when the National Governors Association came together to create what were called the Common Core State Standards. You may remember this movement. I know it's not popular now, but it was really popular at the time. And it was an interesting moment because it wasn't the federal government telling everybody what to do. Instead, it was the governors coming together and saying, as governors for our states, we're going to come up with a shared picture of what we should all be doing in education. Really a beautiful example, honestly, of federalism at work, of the states collaborating with each other. And when the governors got together and set out to create the Common Core state standards, they had 3 goals. They were going to create STEM standards, English language arts standards, and social studies standards. They achieved the first 2. And even though states have walked away from the official nomenclature of the Common Core, many states still have those standards all the way through their public school curricula. But the social studies standards, those ended up on the cutting room floor. They couldn't do it. And again, because some wanted to tell the story of our history as a story of the problems of racial domination and slavery and oppression and genocide of indigenous peoples. And others wanted to tell our history as a story of triumphs and accomplishments, inventions, successful victories in world wars, and the like. The gory or the glory? Like, which story was it? And because that fight couldn't be resolved, we did not end up with social studies standards. That meant less time in school on social studies, because what's not tested, in public schools doesn't get taught. And so that's why we are where we are. And so reversing this trend is really about, can we, folks with gray in our hair, get along well enough to agree on what we should teach for social studies?
Well, and you have offered, along with a number of colleagues, a roadmap, the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, and picking up on this fight between those who want to tell one narrative or have one narrative and the other narrative, instead of maybe, as you said, educating for a candid world, wrestling with principles. One of the roadmap principles is cultivate civic honesty and reflective patriotism. The notion that you can love and critique your nation simultaneously. I have 2 parts to this question, but first it's just simply, could you say, what does reflective patriotism mean?
I can, but do you want the short version or the long version?
And which version would you all like? The medium version.
All right. Okay, I think I heard enough people say long version. Thank you, friends. So, thank you for asking about the Educating for American Democracy roadmap. It is an effort, it has been an effort of a very big community across the nation of educators and scholars who come from every possible background, including different political backgrounds. We built a cross-ideological group who were going to link arms and answer the question, what should we be teaching in our K-12 education? And the reason I want to say this is because it's important for understanding reflective patriotism. Before we got started, we said to each other, we know we are going to hit things we disagree on. The whole history of this field is about people disagreeing with each other. But we feel so passionately about the urgency of getting kids civic education again, a rich civic education, that we're going to link arms. And when we hit the things we disagree on, we're just going to pause and we're going to wrestle it through until we come up with some kind of compromise. All right? And so we got to work, and within 2 weeks we had to stop, okay? Because we were already disagreeing so badly. And the thing we were disagreeing on was the question of, were we educating kids for life in a democracy or in a republic? Right, you recognize that question. All right, now, you wouldn't think it would necessarily be a sort of show-stopping question. Both words were used at the time of the founding. Hamilton called it a representative democracy, Madison called it a republic. So you would think that we could probably all just use both words, it would be okay. But no, we had to have a knockdown, drag-out fight about these 2 terms. And what became clear was that the people who were advocating for the word democracy were prioritizing participation, popular sovereignty, universal inclusion. And the people who were arguing for republic were prioritizing constitutionalism, rule of law, order, and structure. So back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We came to understand that this was the nature of the actual sort of values, what mattered to people and why, underneath the dispute. And so we were able to say, okay, fine. Let's say we're educating kids for life in a constitutional democracy. How's that? So that's what we did. So when you read the roadmap, you'll see that we're educating primarily for life in a constitutional democracy. Sometimes you see the word republic. Sometimes you see a spare democracy. Now, another thing that we hit that we had to wrestle about was the question of how we think about the bonds that we Americans have with one another. this is actually a point in which there's very significant disagreement between left and right. So for the right, the most important word is patriotism. All right, and patriotism we should be educating for, and it captures the kind of affection we should have for our country and for each other. On the left, the word that plays the same role is solidarity. Okay? And so you're back and forth, trying to figure this one out. What were we going to do? What we were very clear on was that across the two sides, everybody was committed to the idea that we wanted to cultivate in students a sense of mutual commitment to one another, despite whatever kinds of viewpoint differences they might have. We also wanted to cultivate a commitment to the country itself and to inspire love of country. So as we worked this through, somebody had the brilliant idea of bringing our attention to Alexis de Tocqueville's phrase, reflective patriotism. So it's actually an old phrase, it's not a new phrase, reflective patriotism. But what it means, of course, is that it does matter to have a bond to this country that has given us our home, both in ways that are rewarding and satisfying and in ways that are frustrating and aggravating for many. Both of those things are true. And as we love that country, we want to be able to be in a clear-eyed, loving relationship, a relationship where we can be honest about faults and seek improvements at the same time that we are able to affirm all that is valuable. So that idea of reflective patriotism captures the notion that it's possible for us to name shortcomings in our country and to work together with others on overcoming them, and at the same time maintain a strong sense of love of country and mutual commitment of citizens to one another. So I hope that answered your question.
It did. So how do we confront, this is sort of the next step, so that's the process that got us or got your group to reflective patriotism. How do we confront loving and critiquing the nation by different groups from becoming a subjective exercise, where one person's patriotism is another person's criticism? You've spoken to that a little bit just now, but it makes me think of James Madison's comment in Federalist number 10 that no one should be a judge in his own cause. How do we get that reflective part, I guess, in the patriotism where you can have those disagreements, use the word patriotism, use the words love of country without it turning back into the fight? Or how did your group navigate that? Because it seems to me that's the moment we're in. It's that those words continue to create the kind of antagonism that you faced as a group.
For sure. No, they do. And we collectively have a lot of work to change that dynamic, a lot of work ahead of us. So this is exactly where the question of the value of democratic institutions comes in. At the end of the day, the entire point of democratic institutions is to give people who disagree with each other a mechanism for making decisions together. Every political group has disagreement. It really doesn't matter how sort of on the surface homogeneous the group might be. The definition of politics is basically that we have different interests and conflicting points of view. So the beauty of democracy is that the opportunity to experience freedom as a part of a self-governing community is the reward for participating in a process that will yield a result that doesn't line up with what anybody precisely wants. So the hard question is how to navigate through the process of participating in institutions. And so what we try to do, both when we think about education and what we try to do in our own process, is to actually help people be ready to hear the values and commitments of others. To start with exactly the question that you and your colleagues start with. What matters to you and why? What do you value and why? And to have clarity about that personally for oneself so that one can share that with others, but then also to be a really good listener about the answers other people have. Our experience is that when you can surface underlying values, you can actually create new solution space. That doesn't mean you resolve all disputes into some sort of third way solution. But what it does do is mean that you can find those opportunities when they exist more easily, but also more importantly, you can maintain your focus on the human dignity of the person that you're interacting with. Because that, at the end of the day, is what it takes to anchor a sound or healthy decision, is that we are able to walk through those institutional processes of debate and deliberation and taking a vote where some win and some lose in a way where we're always also affirming our basic respect for the other human beings in the process with us. And I guess that's the part I would want to underscore. Really, that question of that culture of mutual respect. It is actually necessary for the ongoing health of democracy. And so when we talk about democratic education, educating for American democracy, there's a lot of stuff to know, a lot to know about the three branches of government and checks and balances and how a town government is structured and how that's different from a state government and the like. All kinds of knowledge to pack into our heads, but just as important are really a set of dispositions. Civic reciprocity, really a key one. Civic self-confidence, civic self-care. Those are the ones we tend to focus on in our work. And those dispositions are necessary for the institutions to keep working.
Within the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, there's several points, but there's another one that states, help students understand the chronological timeline of events in history, core themes, and civic concepts related to the philosophical foundations of democracy. You've spoken to this somewhat, but I'd like you to unpack for the audience your conversation around the tensions and the relationship between liberty and equality, probably the two terms that people think of the most or most often with these founding documents or founding principles. And then as a second part of that question, to hear a little bit about the importance of talking about political equality versus just equality as a general term.
So, all right, philosophy. Okay, are we ready? So, for starters, the Declaration expresses, and I agree with the Declaration on this point, that all human beings are created equal. That is, we have a certain basic moral equality. What does that mean to say we're all created equal? It does not mean that we're all the same, right? Some are taller, some are shorter, some are faster, some are slower, some read at lightning speed, some struggle with the page. We are all over the map in terms of our faculties. Nonetheless, we are equal in that every single one of us is trying to make tomorrow better than yesterday. And when we try to make tomorrow better than yesterday, what we are doing is making judgments about how our life is going and how we can improve it. And it's that capacity for judgment that makes us moral equals. Now, again, we can exercise that with different degrees of quality and so forth, but nonetheless, the fact that we all have that capacity is what makes us moral equals. So then comes the question, well, if this is a truth about human beings, then what is the right way to organize society to recognize this? And the Declaration argues, and again, I would agree, I would affirm this, that human beings thrive best, they flourish, when they are able to exercise that capacity for judgment through acts of freedom, both steering their own lives in their private sphere, but then also collaborating with others to steer our collective life. That way, none of us is subject to the arbitrary whims of others when we're able to steer our own lives in private and be a co-author of public decisions. Alrighty? So what I've just described for you is a picture of what freedom consists of, emerging from the basic fact of human moral equality. Freedom is the opportunity to live in such a way as to make good on that capacity that we have for judgment. That requires us to have rights of political participation alongside having protections of our life and private sphere. All right? So freedom, in other words, as I've just described it, is an outgrowth of basic human equality. So that's the sense in which they come together. Human equality is the first fact, protection of freedom, both to be free in our private lives, but also free to participate in a shared public life. That freedom is the necessary realization of what our equality makes possible, to activate our human potential, okay? Now, there's a long sort of story about how sometimes people see freedom and equality as conflicting with each other, and you're welcome to ask me about that if you'd like to. I won't go into that right now. But just to say, with regard to Dean Fitzsteward's last question about equality, the picture I've just described is one where I've named two kinds of equality: moral equality and political equality. And those really are at the heart of the story about what democratic governance is about. Now, there are many other kinds of equality we could also think about. We might think about economic equality or economic egalitarianism, or gender equality or racial equality. There are all kinds of other categories of equality. And sometimes over the course of the history of philosophy, people have focused more on one concept of equality or another. So for example, Karl Marx, for instance, was much more focused on economic equality, right? That's what sort of communism was about. So the important point is to say that the concept of equality, you have to, if somebody invokes it, you always have to ask them, well, which concept of equality do you mean? Are you talking about basic human moral equality? Are you talking about political equality? Are you talking about economic equality? And how do you think these different things may relate to each other or not? So I think that was sort of the definitional point you were hoping to hear.
Thank you. It's impressive, isn't it? Along those lines that were in that roadmap, this helping students understand the chronological timeline of events in history, which could also be sort of read as facts. And you've alluded to this a little bit, but history is often thought of as facts and then the battleground for those facts or your selective facts. So how do we arrive at a set of facts or the chronological timeline of history?
That's a super interesting question.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to move from philosophy to historiography. That's what we're doing. It's interesting. The roadmap that I just described for you, I didn't really give you much of a description of what's in it. It does cover content of what our big group of 300 thought should be taught in a K through 12 education. It is, though, structured as a series of questions. All right. So it's not a list of facts. It is organized chronologically, but it's a series of questions. And the point of this is that to activate the most rich kind of learning, we want to invite learners into inquiry, into a process of thinking for themselves. So we want them to learn how to take historical evidence, take primary sources, and answer questions about history. So nonetheless, of course, yes, we gave the roadmap a chronological background, or backbone rather. The questions are ordered in a sequence. And maybe I'll just give you a couple of examples of the way in which what we did with the questions was sometimes ask people to enter into the hard things that we debate and dispute without ourselves predetermining the answers. So for instance, one hotly contested question right now in the country is, what counts as the American founding? There are folks who have made the case that 1619 should be seen as the founding moment for America. And that is the story that is about the beginning of slavery in continental America. Then, of course, there is 1776 as a critical moment of founding. And there is 1788 and 1789 as a really important moment of founding with the Constitution. And so there is a question in the roadmap. What is a founding? How do you decide what counts as a founding? What's the relationship between a political founding, 1776, 1788, and a social founding? Maybe that's what 1619 is about at some level, et cetera. So the point is that we did, for the things that are the hardest questions, frame them, or the most kind of hotly contested things, frame them as questions for people to dig into in order to invite people to make up their own minds. Also, we wanted to recognize that educational choices will vary from state to state across this country. That is one of the great beauties of a federalist system, is it's okay if things are a bit different from one state to the next. But what we really wanted to achieve with the roadmap was to ensure that everybody was participating in the same conversation.
Thank you. I have two more questions. Well, I have a lot more, but I'm only going to ask two, and then we'll open it up. So I've got two more questions. Technology. The Democracy Renovation Lab thinks a lot about technology and AI in relation to education and democratic life. What is your lab discovering about the ever-evolving technologies, including AI, as we engage with and think about educating for democracy?
Oh my gosh, that's a really big question. Let me talk to you a little bit about AI and the challenge that we all face right now with AI. Then maybe with your questions and comments at the microphone too, you can also share your thoughts about what the implications are for education. So I see us right now as living through something roughly equivalent to the age of electrification, all right? There was the before and there was the after. There were horses and buggies, and then everything was electrified, okay? And electric stations had to be built all over the country and all over every country as electricity changed how laundry was done. So women didn't have to be tethered to washboards any longer, and automotives and transportation and communication was transformed and so forth. Everything changed, all right? Just think about that, right? Everything changed when electricity came. Everything is going to change with AI. It's the same level of transformation, okay? So then the really hard thing is to figure out precisely how do we want to steer this transformation. Currently, there are three paradigms, three mental models in the world for how this transformation might be steered, all right? There's one that goes by the name, there's a sort of ideology called NRX that it calls itself sort of techno-libertarian accelerationism. There's always lots of jargon involved in this conversation. This is the view, basically, that innovation should just be let rip, completely unleashed as fast as possible so we can see what technology can do. It can get rid of all old things, all old institutions, all old governance mechanisms. The people who are most talented and are best at it will drive this process. They'll make incredible amounts of money. They'll build up huge amounts of capital. Then capital will be able to steer the structures of governance for the world as a whole. Okay, that's model one. And I'm not making it up. There's a lot of writing on this subject. Peter Thiel, Srinivasan, Balaji Srinivasan is another key author who wrote a book called Network States. You want to take a look at it if you want to understand this point of view. That's model one. Model two is the effective altruism model, or the sort of corporate technocracy model. This is Sam Altman, who runs OpenAI. And his model is also pretty top-down, sort of corporate control of the steering of AI. He worked really hard to sort of block open source models, basically at the very beginning of the process. He's losing that battle because China has managed to kind of crack that open. But in his model, similar sort of thing, not quite as accelerationist, doesn't need to move quite so fast, but does think that the powers of AI should be sort of controlled by his company, single company. He does care about the impacts of this on ordinary people in contrast to the first model. And his caring about those impacts means he thinks that AI will replace basically all workers, all humans in all functions. And again, massive amounts of capital will be accrued to some small number of capital holders. And that's okay because then they can provide everybody else with a universal basic income. Okay, that's model two. I'm not making this stuff up. All right? Now model three is called the plurality model. And the best examples of this are actually in Taiwan and Estonia. This is a very different model from the first two. This is a model so the first two models both think that there's some kind of singular intelligence that needs to be replicated and superseded. So you get super intelligence that is better than human intelligence. The third model instead sees intelligence as multiple, right? Human beings have a whole bunch of different kinds of intelligence. Machines also have a whole bunch of different kinds of intelligence. There isn't one single kind of intelligence that we want to kind of replicate and overcome. Instead, what we want is technology that complements all the multiplicities of human intelligence that we have. We also want its work in the economy to be human complementing, to extend our capacities, not replace them. So take Zoom as an example, right? We all use video conferences now. Video conferences do not replace something that we humans could already do, right? Like, that wasn't the thing we could do. That extends our human ability. So they focus on tech development of that kind. They're much more interested in decentralized economic structures for funding tech, more interested in open source, for example, as a method and sort of way of moving it forward. Also really believe in the value of human pluralism and in human society and the ability of human beings to govern themselves through democratic institutions. And so what that means in Taiwan is that they have started really using technology to redesign representation so that it does a better job of pulling people's voices into governance and a better job of sorting through disagreements and finding solutions. In Estonia, what it means is that they've really drawn on technology to improve how government services operate. So kind of like Doge, but with a very strong commitment to democracy in it. Okay? Well, so, anyway, so then what does that all mean for education? The first two models, basically it means the only people who really do well are people with STEM educations. All right, and like all investment is in STEM ed. The third model is actually about maintaining the full range of human capacities. So it has, again, a very rich model of education, a real focus on educating for digital competence for all people so that people don't get taken advantage of by technology, so that people can continue to control the technology that enters into their lives and the like. You can kind of tell which one I lean to, right? I didn't really hide that very well. Nonetheless, there's a lot of learning and thinking for all of us to do right now. It's not a small moment in this regard. So I appreciate the question, and I don't have the answers. I can only describe the problem.
So for my last question here is around, kind of coming full circle to, you're talking about the Declaration for People in a Candid World and the responsibilities that all of us must undertake to engage the Declaration, our civic life, and so on. So talk to us about responsibility. You've talked about or written about responsibility as dependent on self-understanding, which you called hard, low tunneling. The founders also stressed responsibility as a function of virtue and character. How do we, as we think about educating for American democracy, how do we cultivate responsibility? How do we cultivate those dispositions you talked about earlier, the norms you talked about with our students related to institutional life, that it's not just institutions, there's character, there's responsibility, there's dispositions. How do we think about virtue, character, responsibility, dispositions in our quest to educate for American democracy?
I think that's just such an important question, and I know that is also what your institute is working on, and the Honors College and so forth. So I also just want to commend you for being engaged in that effort. I mean, for one thing, I think we have to bring intentionality to the work. It doesn't happen by accident. So maybe here what I'll do is speak about the K through 12 civic education work that I do in Massachusetts, where I mentioned we do explicitly in our, for example, grade 8 curriculum, highlight the dispositions of civic reciprocity, civic self-confidence, and civic self-care. Civic reciprocity is about the I to we connection, the fact that my job is to connect the things I care about to a sense of community and responsibility to a broader sense of community. So I'll come back to that one in a moment, because that is really where the responsibility concept lies. Civic self-confidence is about knowing how to take action effectively and feeling confident in doing so. So that does connect to the responsibility of stepping up as a leader, stepping up to serve in your community and the like. And then civic self-care is about the fact that active civic engagement isn't always easy, right? You encounter disagreement. In this day and age, given our social media environment, you encounter bullying and toxicity. And so you have to be prepared to protect yourself from that kind of behavior. You have to be committed to never contributing to it, never, ever, ever, never, but also to protect yourself from it. And so then the question is, okay, if those are the dispositions we are focused on, how do we really educate around them? A part of it is storytelling. Stories matter, right? You know, sort of examples of people who have lived these dispositions and can speak to the value of them in their own lives make a huge difference. Also, we have lots of sort of activities that we engage our students in. So we also have a kind of values activity for our students where they have to talk about what they value and why, but then they have to listen to their fellow students. And they have to be able to say back to their fellow students, you know, what they've heard, what they've learned from their fellow students, in order to start telling, in effect, reciprocity stories. You know, what are the connections between what I value and what you value? So we sort of really kind of pinpoint the moments in the curriculum where students are being asked to do that. And we say, hey, like right now, what you're doing, that's civic reciprocity. How did it feel? Turns out, usually feels pretty good, all right? Civic reciprocity, to engage in that kind of I to we exchange, it makes you feel warm inside. Like it really actually does. And so you have to call people's attention to the fact that to embrace these dispositions or virtues or features of character is actually good for their own sense of self and will be intrinsically rewarding to them. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a window into how we approach it. It's not the whole story, but I hope it's a bit of a window.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Allen. Please join me in thanking her for her wonderful comments. So I'm going to get off the stage, turn off my mic. You're welcome to queue up at the microphones to ask questions. We'll go for another 15 or so minutes, and you'll know that we're done when I walk back up on the stage to relieve Professor Allen from her long day of engagement with questions. So please.
And if you don't mind, please do share your name and.
Absolutely. Hi, Professor Allen. Thank you so much for, a very scintillating lecture. I'm Mo. I am just a member of the community here, not a student, not anymore. But I was wondering what your thoughts are on, so it's a follow-up on the second to last question about AI. How do you think AI might be used to educate on civics and democracy?
Yeah, no, great question. Thank you so much, Mo. I appreciate it. AI has a lot of potential for education, as I'm sure many of you are reading about. So it will provide us a great opportunity to personalize learning so that when students are stuck on a particular problem, they're interacting with something that can help them know what kind of problem is exactly the right problem to try next to get unstuck. So there just is huge potential. I think in terms of educating for civics specifically, what I'm most interested in there probably is the potential of AI to help us design new tools for democratic practice and the invitation to young people to participate in those designs. So I'll just give you one example. It's an example I talked about earlier today, so I apologize for the repetition. But in Taiwan, a group of folks have invented a tool called Polis, which is now used by the government, which is for public debate about contentious issues. But it's different from an opinion survey where you might just all get 4 choices. You have to sort of check a box what you think. And instead, it invites people to just use natural language. However you want to talk about the issue, you can just say whatever you want to say. And there's sort of a structured element to it where you have to comment on a few other people's comments before you can actually add your own original comments. So you have to make those kind of connections that I mentioned. And then what AI can provide is the ability to sort of synthesize everything that's been contributed and find points of synergy or agreement that may not have been visible to people on the surface before they entered into the debate. All right. And so it actually opens up solution space and makes people feel more heard than when the government's sort of reporting back on how they're thinking about decision making. So the point is just that there's a lot of stuff we can do now, actually, that we couldn't do before. And I would love to invite young people into thinking about how can we improve how our institutions of representation work by drawing on the affordances of AI. So I'd love that kind of project-based learning aspect that's now available to us. Thanks for your question, Mo. Try getting a little closer. That might work. Okay, then there might be a switch to flip on it. Let's see.
Okay, now everybody gets to hear me.
There you go.
Hi, my name's Theo, and as a kid who goes to school 5 days a week, I would like to know whose responsibility is it to teach kids about 1 or 2 or 3 things that multiple parties don't agree on, especially when maybe the parents or the guardians and the school or the government don't agree?
Wow, great question, Theo. Thank you for that question. So one of the things that we, in our work that I was describing, do advocate for is supporting kids in learning civil disagreement. So how to talk about contentious questions in the classroom where people are not going to agree with each other. So in that regard, the group of educators that I described, we do think it's the responsibility of schools and educators to make that kind of conversation possible for students. At the same time, an important thing to say is that any successful civic education will engage the community, will engage parents. So this is not about something that schools should do separately from families. Schools need to share their civic education curricula with families and communities and build a sense of understanding about both why these conversations matter, because it is preparing young people to participate as citizens in our biggest public spheres, and the norms for doing that, namely that teachers will not be providing their own opinions. They'll be providing students with a range of good examples of opinions across the perspective and helping students think about what counts as a good argument and what values does that student bring to the table that will help them make judgments about what their own views are. Did that make sense as an answer to your question? Thank you very much, Theo. Appreciate it.
Hi, my name's Greg. I work in the renewable energy industry. I wanted to thank you first for coming. I've seen you on PBS in a number of talks, and they've always been very interesting. But for my question, first, I wanted to kind of boil AI out as just another intelligence population in the world. But I believe in a society where it works best if you have 70% altruism and 30% pushback, or locking down. So you're mostly good, but at some point you do have to push back. And I'd like your opinion on how, when you have, because I think I've heard a little bit of this, but when you have people that aggressively are shutting down another side, how do you enforce your right to your 30% of saying, no, it's my turn now. I get to have a statement here. This is a problem, and you're shutting me out. How do you push back at that boundary so that you do get a legitimate 70-30 on both sides?
Okay, now, and I mean, I think that's generous to say 70-30 as opposed to 50-50, I have to say. So it's a great question, and it's context specific, the answer. So, for example, as an educator, I think it's my job to facilitate a classroom where everybody is getting airtime. And I will say, for example, something I do is I often will actually start my classes with an anonymous survey for the students so that they can share their views completely, and I can get a real sense of the spread of opinion in the classroom, because what I will find often is that there's a minority point of view that students won't necessarily feel comfortable expressing. So I will take on the job of articulating that point of view until such a point in time that the students realize, hey, it's okay, I can do that too, and then they will start to speak up. So that's my job as an educator, to make that happen. We don't always in life encounter spaces where somebody's taking responsibility for making, shared time possible. So I will also share a crazy story, which is that many years ago, more than 20 at this point, I served as a dean. So I admire Andrew over here, who apparently has been a dean since, the dawn of time, as best as I can tell. Just teasing. Anyway, and so long time ago, and I was a young dean. I was sort of about 30 when I was appointed dean of humanities at the University of Chicago. There were 12 deans. We met once a week with the president and the provost. There were only 2 women, and everybody else was 20 years older than I was. So I wasn't getting a lot of airtime in those conversations. And that felt terrible, because my colleagues had wanted me to be a dean. I was supposed to be representing them in that space and so forth. So I took boxing lessons. I'm not kidding. I learned how to box, all right? And that made it possible for me to hold my space in a conversation. And so, not that I was ever horrible to anybody, but I did the verbal equivalent of jabbing if I had to make space. I go, yep, you're gonna give me a little space here. So there are things that you can learn to make space. Now, what matters to me about that, though, and sharing that story, is once you know those things, how do you, exercise them or use them? And in various ways, I don't think I did it explicitly, but there's a lot of Aristotle in my thinking. I've learned a lot from Aristotle. And one of the virtues, we were talking about virtues, that was sort of an almost Aristotelian conversation that we were having. Courage is one, and justice is a virtue, and wisdom is a virtue. But my favorite Aristotelian virtue is a virtue that he says doesn't have a name. Nobody knows what to call it, but it's a virtue for interacting with strangers. And it's basically a virtue that has the habits of friendship without the emotions of friendship. So that's always my guide, that I always have to be interacting with everybody else, even if I'm making space for myself, in a way that is compatible with the habits and practices of friendship.
I wanted to say thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I was struck by, at the beginning of your talk, when you talked about slavery and the institution of slavery and how it contrasted with the liberal ideals of the Declaration of Independence. I think one of my primary question, and I suppose I have two, is firstly, isn't it the case that the economic structure of especially the Southern slaveholders created a political class that was so opposed to the actualization of those liberal ideals? Isn't that what made that impossible at the time and then for the next century practically? And then secondly, don't those economic structures and their barriers to the realization of liberal ideals still continue today? For example, isn't it hard for tenants to have a liberal democratic discourse with their landlord, or for workers to have that with their boss? Thank you.
Thank you. Lots of hard questions in that for sure. So the history of the economics of slavery is pretty interesting, actually, and a little complicated. So slightly more complicated than your question suggests, in the sense that at the point of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, slavery appeared to be on the way out. All right. So in that regard, I mean, there's a certain accuracy to what you're saying. That is to say, George Washington, for example, did not expect it to last, and he, in his will, freed his slaves. Then what changed was the invention of the cotton gin. And the cotton gin permitted a certain kind of industrial scale production of cotton that did entrench enslavement as an economic form. But the question about the ideals and how they would be realized and wrestled through, there were already dynamics of contestation about that that were separate from the economic facts. So the economic facts then torqued the situation for sure. And, in that regard, though, there was never any illusion about what the, Confederacy was about. The Vice President of the Confederacy published a declaration which was explicit in saying, our job is to rewrite the Declaration of Independence because we are the first government to be founded on the idea that people are not created equal, right? So there was never a kind of hypocrisy about it, if you see what I mean. So it's not the case that the economics block the liberal principles. The liberal principles were abandoned in concert with an economic commitment, okay? So that's important because it's not as if the liberal principles had no power or force on their own. They did, in fact. The two systems do not totally sync up with each other. Now, what does that mean in our contemporary context? Yes, absolutely. The question of what's possible with regard to people's empowerment is very much affected by economic structures. If you experience domination in the workplace, it undermines your ability to be a functioning citizen more broadly. If you don't have stable housing, then you can't actually step up and play a role in your community as a public participant. So economic questions and civic questions are very intersecting with each other. The one thing I would just push back on, challenge you on, is the notion that they are simply in lockstep with each other. That I don't actually think is accurate to the history.
Hi, my name is Lauren. I'll just preface this. I'm a disabled sociological researcher, which is why I'm asking this specific question. You talked a lot about the history of education and obviously why education is so important. You talked about the first school being in Boston, 1635 is when it opened. And so I'm wondering, how do we rectify the exclusionary practices of education, specifically referencing it wasn't until 1975 that disabled students were guaranteed rights to an education. And so that's, 50 years from today, and even accommodations up through till now are difficult to access. And the rate of having a bachelor's degree or higher is twice as high for someone who is not disabled.
Thank you for your question, and thank you for sharing your knowledge about the history. So I think you've given us a history that we all recognize, in that this is a country that did not, although there were stated noble ideals, and this relates to the last question as well, our institutional practices did not, in fact, actualize those ideals in full. And one of the, one of my favorite examples of recognition of that from that early point in time was an exchange between Abigail Adams and John Adams, where in the spring of 1776, Abigail knew what was happening. She was actually trying to kind of like hurry John along in the production of the Declaration of Independence. She was then frustrated about the text for the fact that they weren't including women in them. And she wrote to John and said, well, what about the ladies here? And John wrote back and said, look, the principles are for everybody, this notion that people have rights, but the question of how we'll organize power in order to protect those rights, on that, his words were, we'll maintain our masculine system, all right? So they made a separation between the principles of rights for everybody and then the question of the exercise of power. And Abigail wrote back to that and she said, well, the truth is you men don't have a very good track record. And those were not her exact words, but I'm paraphrasing, but roughly she said, the history of husbands is that they have used their power tyrannically. And she said, so we'll give you one more chance, but, she said, if history repeats itself, then we women will have to foment a rebellion for voice and representation. All right, so right at the very beginning, Abigail was saying absolute power corrupts. If we're serious about the rights for everybody, we need to give people voice and representation. So that is really my answer to your question. And in some sense, it's my answer to the question about work and employment as well. What matters actually is voice and representation. Are we creating structures that provide people who are disabled with voice and representation? Because if that exists, then we will also see the changes that are needed in education, for example, that you're pointing to.
Good evening. My name is Ian Thompson. I was actually a student of yours, 3/4 of Greek back in 1997.
Wow.
So
nice to see you.
We're still out there. This time of national politics is disheartening and kind of depressing for some of us. I'm sure it's invigorating for others, but there's a line in your book, "Cuz," that has stuck with me for a long time. I'm probably going to botch it, but it's something like, as we make decisions and others make decisions for us, we shed the lives that might have been. And it's always struck me as a bit of a reckoning with the situation we're in, but also sort of a lament and a mourning. And, I would, 30 years ago, when I was in college, I would have never predicted that I would be defending the principle of participatory democracy, or why restrictions of rights are probably headed in the wrong direction. Having a tremendous amount of public discourse is now being dominated by fundamental debates about things that I thought were sort of settled. And yet now this is why we're in such need of, an education towards democracy again, as if we're starting over. Do you have any words of sort of comfort or solace? I mean, for those who aren't familiar with the book, "Cuz," I mean, it's sort of the watching of the slow demise of a cousin of yours, or at least that's the memoir.
Yeah.
And I sort of feel, in some butchered analogy, that I'm watching a loss of a loved one. What are your words? Like, is there hope seriously, is there hope in this project in my lifetime? Or is the arc of Martin Luther King so large that maybe 100 or 200 years from now, we'll be back to it?
Well, nice to see you,
Thank
for
you.
starters. That was very beautiful and hard question. So I have to make a confession here. This is a little bit like my boxing confession. So we all have mental models for time, how time unspools. Many have the arc of history mental model. I don't. So the mental model I have actually comes from Herodotus. You'll appreciate that. And it's a mental model where there are many different societies around the globe, right? All the different stories in Herodotus of different societies. And in my mental model, they all reside on a sphere. Half of the sphere is in the light and half of it's in the dark. And so societies are always kind of going either up towards the light or down towards the dark, like that, oscillating. And different societies are at different points on the sphere at different points in time. So there's not like a global history where everybody's on the same point of the arc at the same time or something like that. And just as it's possible to move up, it's possible to move back. So Venezuela is a great example of a society that was in pretty good shape. It just slid way down to the dark side of the sphere, right? And so that's the mental model I've always had for history. So it does always make me feel like gains for human flourishing are fragile and that our work is constant. Now, where's the hope in that? I do often think about the civil rights movement, and I think a lot about actually people like Ida B. Wells and Nathan Monroe work. And this analogy will be too extreme for our current moment, so pardon me for that, but nonetheless, it's how I think about things. These were people who, in the 1890s and 1900s, were recording lynchings. They were just cataloging them, just documenting lynchings. Did they live to see 1964 and the Civil Rights Act? They did not. They did not. They died without knowing whether their work to change the fundamental dynamics of American society would yield fruit. Yet they did it anyway. And if they hadn't done it, in 1964, there never would have been a Civil Rights Act. So that's how I approach it. We can do nothing but what our own time requires of us and do it the best we can. And if we do that, we will lay a foundation for somebody else to do something more and better. And we may never know if they, harvest that fruit. But I think we have reason to believe the harvest is possible if we've done that work, when it wouldn't be possible if we had not done the work.
Well, thank you, Professor Allen. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for your questions. We appreciate your attention and your good faith in this conversation. What are you yelling at me, Isaac, or waving? Oh, yes, the Civic Fair. That's also very much near and dear to Professor Allen's heart and the Institute. So please circulate back there, see where you might get involved or engaged or learn something new. Thank you again, Professor Allen, for your time.
Thank you.